Who dat to you, Saints fans? Welcome into the Who Dat Confessional podcast, where the offseason has started. We've had some interesting slated games to start the playoffs, and hopefully, I don't know if you enjoyed them or didn't enjoy them. Seeing the Cowboys lose, it makes me happy. And then the Eagles' monumental, crazy end-of-the-year collapse, well, I'll be honest, kind of like it as a story, but that means the Buccaneers have now moved on. And yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what I shouldn't be doing. I think the Saints could have won that game too, but you know what? Here we are. Here we are. So 9-8, New Orleans have fired/lost for coaches. So we got to discuss that. There are rumors circulating about Kai Harley having an increased role while Mickey Loomis having a quasi promotion of title, but still probably having his hand in the pot. All these things are things that we're going to have to talk about as P. Carmichael. He's out. Joel Thomas. Well, he got signed by the Giants. That's the New Orleans Saints running back coach. So he's getting signed away. And the New Orleans Saints fired Cody Burns, who was wide receivers coach, as well as a couple other guys. So here we have changes, whether it's Bob Bicknell that you thought was a good move to get rid of, or Pete Carmichael, whatever the reason, whoever the person. We're going to try to cover all those and get y'all's thoughts as well. Brian W. II, Randall, good to see you, Mr. Jerry, Josh Santel, Saints Garcia, Mario Curry, Night Lord, Valley Runners, Shane O'Mac, Kevin Proctor, Paul Parker, Abraham, Gerald Stevenson, everybody else. Who dat to you? Welcome onto the show today as we get ready to get going. So the big one is P. Carmichael's out. So I'll say this. I wish nothing but the best for him as an individual and as a person. And I'll be very clear that even though I had frustrations and many frustrations with him as the play caller, especially over the past couple of years, obviously he's been integral to the New Orleans Saints' success in one way or another over the past 15 years. And credit should be given to that. And, hell, I'll even go as far as say the man should be in the Saints Ring of Honor. Just because it didn't work out with him being the lead signal guy over the past 2 years does not mean he did not contribute to very good New Orleans Saints teams. So as a person, I wish him nothing but the best. Long life, health, and everything else. Hopefully, he has a successful whatever his next venture is, whether it's in the NFL or whether it's somewhere else. So the New Orleans Saints will now have to figure out what they're going to do to fill that spot. And there are several common names that, many people have already mentioned. And those common ones are going to be guys like Ronald Curry, who's the New Orleans Saints pass game coordinator. There's, of course, going to be John Gruden, even Jay Gruden to an extent. Those names have been mentioned previously. And then even beyond that, there are other guys. If you listen to other Saints podcasts, which we always encourage you to get multiple viewpoints, we've had people talk about Joe Brady and Joe Blameyer and hell, even Jared Johnson, which I know the crew over at New Orleans Football have mentioned. And my personal favorite, which we've talked about here on the show, is Clint Kubiak from San Francisco. And obviously the New Orleans Saints cannot interview him if or when the San Francisco 49ers are eliminated from the playoffs or win the Super Bowl, whichever happens first. Then the New Orleans Saints could interview him if they so chose. So they waited a little bit to fire Dennis Allen. Didn't happen on Monday. They waited a little bit, and here we are today. Now you have a New Orleans Saints staff that is missing about half of the offensive staff in terms of the ones that make a lot of the big decisions. Good, bad, ugly? I don't know. I'll say this, anytime you make these type of changes, it's always a gamble, right? And not that I'm trying to backtrack on any of my beliefs, because I do believe that, this is in a lot of ways for the best. I can also sit here and say, though, that Clancy Barone, the tight ends coach, I don't know if that's the right choice to keep him there. Doug Marrone, offensive line coach, I don't know if that's the right choice to keep him there. We'll have to wait and see. But, I have running back coach to fill, wide receiver coach to fill. Maybe they'll add to their offensive assistants. Now, they do have other offensive assistants who are on the staff right now, guys like Kevin Petrie and Jordan Traylor and DJ Williams. Those are all that, just immediately come to mind because, for example, Kevin Petrie, he's been here since Sean Payton was here. So they have a couple of assistants already. And then, of course, the big one being the offensive coordinator spot. And, we'll see how it ends up playing out if you're a New Orleans Saints fan. And then, obviously, the rumors, and I'll go ahead and give credit where the credit is due, I guess, even though it's maybe a little bit premature for credit. I know I talked about last week with the Carolina Panthers seriously pursuing Kai Harley to be their general manager. The New Orleans Saints should do some form of promotion for Mickey Loomis, allowing Kai Harley to be the GM. And the Saints Happy Hour podcast, which I'll go ahead and say has had, sources in the past and has definitely had calls in the past that ended up being something. They've come out and are having a podcast later to discuss this, where they've basically said that Kai's going to be the GM. Nick Underhill would then come out and say, don't expect a role change. So we'll see what this actually means. We're seeing a shakeup in the front office, and we're seeing a shakeup in the offensive coaching staff. What that actually turns into being, we'll have to wait and see. I'm very curious to see what fans, like just generally speaking, who they want to be the offensive coordinator, right? Like I know I've harped a lot about Kubiak because I love the idea of him coming from both Gary Kubiak, his father, and that tree, as well as the Shanahan tree. And I would argue that the Shanahan tree is one of the most successful trees currently in use in the NFL. And a lot of people have, they get wary when I talk about systems being familiar, because the truth is, Clint Kubiak and the system that he would bring or install would be familiar to a lot of the Saints players. But when I say familiar, I'm not trying to speak of exactly what you've seen the past 2 years. And what I'm saying is that the style of system that they would bring would match what the players you've currently built an offense around would fit, but then you would still expect a lot of differences in situational football and, window dressings and things of that nature. But you look around the NFL, you even look at the playoffs right now, three of the hottest teams, arguably, in the playoffs, with the 49ers, with the Kansas City Chiefs, who managed to pull out a W, and even the Houston Texans and under D'Amico Ryans. They're all using a very modern West Coast offense to have their success. So I don't think that the term West Coast or similar should scare anybody off. It's more of a, how can those individuals or the individual come in as an offensive coordinator, whoever ends up being, find a way to produce something that is relevant, modern, and effective, right? Regardless of what type of play calling system it is, whether it's West Coast, Aaron R. Perkins, regardless of if it's a primary man blocking scheme versus zone blocking scheme. The New Orleans Saints primarily zone with Alvin Kamara, but Jamal Williams probably more of a power guy. You look at most NFL teams, they run a variety. They might lean heavy to one side. For example, San Francisco, Christian McCaffrey does like their outside zone, or wide zone as other people call it. Either way, whoever ends up being the OC has to be someone who can bring in and actually bring some effective change. That's kind of more the issue here. It's not really about what type of system. It's more who could be effective. And I'll be honest, I tend to kind of want to lean towards young minds, hence why Clint Kubiak comes to mind. He is 36, young, up and coming from two very well-known pedigrees in the NFL. Not that I'm trying to necessarily support nepotism, but we've seen these effective pedigrees in action. And we'll see how it pans out for New Orleans. Now, TJ says he wants Clint Kubiak. Mark Mafode says Drew Brees. And look, I have no issue with Drew Brees being some type of coach, but not offensive coordinator. Simple reason being is I do believe that you need some level of proof. Can you actually fit that role? Can you do that role? Not that I'm saying that he can't, but man, that's a hell of a gamble to just come in and say, hey, Drew, you come call, create, run the offense situationally from the box or from the sidelines, which is very different than doing it from the field, right? And none of this is to say that I don't believe in Drew Brees potentially as an offensive coordinator. Simply that I think that it's not something you can just jump into at an NFL level and do very, very well. So I would love for him to join the coaching staff in some form, but I probably wouldn't throw him that immediately. Now, Abraham says Des Bryant for wide receiver coach. Abraham, good to see you around. Those that don't know, those listening after this is aired live, Abraham is arguably the biggest Des Bryant fan to ever hit New Orleans. And it happens. It happens. Jimmy says Dennis Allen buying him 2 more years. We'll see. Right? I think most people at this point would love to move on from Dennis Allen. And I think that's a completely legitimate desire to have. I think that we've talked about this. He's going to be here, right, in 2024, and that's fine. Not a guarantee for the year after. When he signed that contract, I said, look, 3 years is how I expect this to go before he has legitimate, he might be gone, meter, hitting that edge, depending on how he ends up performing. If he doesn't make the playoffs in year 3, I would be surprised if he's still around. Now, Mickey Loomis and company in the front office, they believe that they're trending in that direction. We'll see if that direction actually comes to fruition. But they believe they're moving in that direction. I personally, I'm a little bit more I hate to use the word negative. I feel like I'm being pragmatic, and I'm curious what chat thinks in the conversation here. But I just think that the New Orleans Saints overall have not shown anything that makes you believe that they are a contender. I think that's kind of the point. But at the same time, we'll simply wait. Now, Kraft says Loomis and company will hire from within and go with Ronald Curry as an offensive coordinator. And I would say, look, I have no issue with the idea of Ronald Curry as an offensive coordinator. And I think that he's a guy that's earned his shot. At the same time, he's an unknown. He's less of an unknown than Drew Brees, but he's still an unknown. And we also can't forget the fact that, like or hate John Gruden as an individual, I mean, we certainly can't ignore the reasons why he is not currently coaching in the league. I think it would be, disingenuous of us to just simply accept that and ignore everything that transpired with him leaving the Raiders. But at the same time, we know the New Orleans Saints in the past couple of months have talked with him. How much those have progressed into him being an OC, don't really know. But he's obviously a name that's in the conversation. And now that you have Pete Carmichael officially out of New Orleans, it's definitely something we've got to discuss. Kraft says Pete's firing changes nothing. Saints are reshuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. I would say this, Kraft. To an extent, I understand where you're coming from. As a fan, you have every right to be frustrated with how this team has performed. And even Lance Moore, who was very critical of the New Orleans Saints, especially offensively most of the season, said that at the end of the year, the offense probably wasn't their problem. But I'd also say that I feel like that was the Saints for the past 2 years. And like if it takes you an entire season to figure it out, and again, not trying to be negative, right? I'm not trying to be negative. But if we go back to even 2020, I mean, the Saints were kind of figuring it out at the end of the year then too. You remember that they ended the year with 3 of their 4 of their last games with a win. They didn't beat Carolina in Week 18, but I don't think it really mattered up until that point, if I'm being completely honest. But they won 3 of, honestly, go even beyond that. They won like 4 of their last 7 and 4 of their last 6 if you ignore the Carolina game. So, they had figured it out, quote unquote, at the end of the year. And what did they do this year? End of the year, they won 4 of their last 5. So, yeah, they did better, right? But you can't wait until the end of the season to figure things out. And you weren't able to beat critical teams like beating Atlanta in Atlanta. You weren't able to beat Minnesota in Minnesota that had a backup quarterback that had been there a week. You blew a big lead to a team that shut out too, by the way. Love and the Green Bay Packers for taking out the Dallas Cowboys, but you blew a lead to them early in the season that could have changed the game, right? Or changed the outcome of how the season went. So figuring things out at the end of the year is tough to give too much credit to. And I think that what can change Kraft, that isn't just moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, is if whoever ends up being the OC can get something working consistently early on. Even if that's not a top unit, any level of consistency would put this offense in a better position than what we've seen the past 2 years. Isn't me trying to say that, they were completely bad or even great at the end of the season. I think the biggest issue is just consistency. And we also have to acknowledge that an aging defense, which the New Orleans Saints, according to a couple of different trackers, you really don't have to quote trackers. You can look at the ages. Oldest defense in the NFL. So you've got that to worry about as well when you come into this draft. How do we address it? Well, they got both lines that need massive addressing, and some of your star players on defense are aging themselves out. That's just the nature of how it goes. It's not a negative statement, it's just a factual statement. So there are a lot of things that they've got to do, and free agency will be a big deal. Draft will be a big deal. But I can tell you one thing with almost utmost certainty. This New Orleans Saints team is going to try to sell you, the New Orleans Saints fan, that they are still a contender, that the window is open, and that they can make a push, that they can win the division, and they are going to sell that to you. Now, I am not telling you to buy. I am telling you that's exactly how they're going to operate this offseason. They're going to operate as if they can draft 5, 6, 7 guys, and that contributes to them being a contender, that they can go pick up 4 or 5 free agents and role players and be a contender. That's how they're going to treat it. Now, whether y'all choose to believe it or not is completely up to you, starting with the offensive coaching changes. You see now, they are not rebuilding. Dennis Allen is still in the building. Even some of the primary pieces that DA has brought in, a la Doug Marrone, are still there. So they still believe what they have, even if we don't. Ryan says, I was surprised by Cody Burns being let go. It looked like he brought some good wide receiver drills and training. Same with Joel Thomas and the running backs. Now, Joel Thomas wasn't really let go. The New York Giants came and poached him. And with the New Orleans Saints not really offering him like an offensive coordinator position, wasn't much that they could do to stop that, which is completely fine, honestly. I think that if he, gets a better opportunity somewhere, I encourage him to take that opportunity. I think that's great for him and his family. But the Cody Bergman, I can understand being a little bit of a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, even to myself. I'm not clairvoyant. I'm not Restradamus. I didn't necessarily see that one coming. But I also understand the need for change. I will say this, that even though I do like a lot of things I saw from the wide receiver group, there's also a huge swath of things that I can't sit here and ignore, like how most of the season we were complaining about wide receivers running over the top of each other, running the wrong routes, miscommunications, and just sloppy routes. Well, I mean, who are you going to blame? Top two people to blame for that's going to be your offensive coordinator and your wide receivers coach. So, yeah, I mean, do I think that everything's getting an answer? No, I mean, it's not. But at the same time, for whatever reason, we know the reason. They're making moves as if they can make a push. Richard Boydera says, where are we too hard on the offense this year? Derek was hurt for the last 5 weeks. He was arguably top 5 in the NFC. I'll say this. What I saw from Derek Carr at the end of the season is exactly what Derek Carr was or I expected, which is good, not great quarterback play. And I'm being very truthful there. I don't think even in the last 5 weeks he was a great quarterback. That is not, to be very clear, me saying that he was anywhere close to a bad quarterback. I would argue that the last 5 games, he was a very good quarterback. In fact, his quarterback rating over the final 5 games of the season was right around 110. That's really good. I still think he's a top 5 quarterback, but that's okay. If healthy Derek Carr plays like that and was protected because he was also throwing like 72, 73% over the last 5 games, which is Drew Brees type percentage numbers, not Drew Brees, but I mean, he threw 14 touchdowns over the last 5 games, which is clearly way more than he did like the first 5 games where he had 4 touchdown passes. So yeah, he definitely played better. But I also don't think that we were being too harsh on them either. I'm glad that they figured it out. But again, why did it take so long to figure out? I think that comes back to coaching. So that comes back to coaching. When it comes back to how you see guys perform, or you look at across the league and, the success that you're able to translate pretty quickly, that's what you're looking for. And an example of that, I think, is the Houston Texans. Right now, I don't believe in complete blow it up and complete rebuilds, like just trash everything and start from scratch. I'm not a fan of that as an idea. But I will say that who started getting their offense figured out really quickly, really early? The Houston Texans. And new quarterback, new offensive coordinator, first-time offensive coordinator, by the way, new system, but they found a way to figure it out and win. In fact, if you remember, that was week 6 that they beat us in a close one when our defense was playing at arguably its highest level. They won. But even before that, they had scored 37 points and 30 points against Jacksonville and Pittsburgh. So that was an offense that, while took time to become the offense that you're seeing now in the playoffs, who just beat the Cleveland Browns in a just slob the snot, just a snot out of them, took them time to get to that. But they were still effective early on, whereas we can't say the same thing about the Saints offense. And it's just from a fundamental aspect, we saw issues with it there. So when you talk about who can come in, the main thing you're looking for is just somebody who can bring some level of consistency to a division that most people would say is still a weak division. Now, Pick and Pony says, any chance we're all wrong about Dennis Allen? Hate the idea that fans see something so obvious, yet a GM and owner do not. I mean, there is a non-0% chance that Saints fans are wrong. Absolutely. Sure. Do I personally believe that? No. But at the same time, yeah, absolutely. Because we're not in the facility every day. And let's just state the obvious. Nobody, myself included, you throw the fact that I've covered the team and the scout training and all that out the window. Throw it out the window. Even with that, it's pennies to what individuals who actually work in the NFL every day know and see, right? So whether I have sources or you have sources, or you trained as a scout, I trained as a scout, or hell, even if you played in the league, without being in the facility, you can never really have a true feeling of the pulse of that team at any given time. So sure, we could be wrong. Do I think that we're wrong? I don't pick at ponies, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that, slight changes can't draw improvement, or you could see a regression having a team that's the oldest in the league going into a season where they're going to, in theory, play tougher opponents. We'll see how that pans out. But again, I always love to talk about the any given Sunday concept and how teams can really fall on their face. I mean, you tell me 2 months ago who legitimately thought that the Eagles weren't Super Bowl contenders, and yet the Eagles, after that 49ers game, were a shell of themselves. And I even made this comment on a couple of the plays that they were running in the playoffs. It looks so much like the early Saints of 2023 offense because they were doing stuff like missing pressure packages and just running straight verticals down the field, not attacking the middle. It was literally like, I was like, holy crap. It's like New Orleans from freaking October decided to go play for Philly. But 2 months ago, we thought Philly was going to be the Super Bowl team. Then they lost 5 of their last 6, and then they just lost to Tampa. And I will say this honestly. I believe Atlanta, New Orleans, and Tampa could have beat the Philly team that you saw this past Monday, last night, if you're listening live. That's just the nature of the NFL, which is crazy. So Don says quarterback play was down across the league as well. Was Carr any worse than Mahomes or Josh Allen this year? If so, it wasn't a major difference. Now, I will slightly disagree with that because especially what I love listening to is podcasts of players. Like, no offense to people like myself who've never played in the league, but I mean, I think a lot of fans are like that. You want to listen to guys who are in the league right now. So like we talk about the Kelsey's podcast. You talk about some other podcasts out there. I love hearing guys who are in the league right now talk about the guys who are in the league right now. It just gives you an insight that you can't get from watching Rev Deuce on the Who Dat Confessional podcast, which is completely fine. And one thing I'll say is when you hear these guys talk, when you hear the defenders talk, whether it's linebackers or secondary players, they talk about certain quarterbacks who just do things special. And you hear Patrick Mahomes get brought up. You also hear CJ Stroud's name get brought up, but you don't hear Derek Carr's name get brought up. So while I will absolutely acknowledge that Patrick Mahomes definitely did not have the statistical season that we've seen in the past, hell, how much of that could be Eric Bieniemy leaving? I don't know. He did not have the statistical season he had in the past, but I also would say that it's misleading how close his stats are to Derek Carr. My opinion. Now, anybody can, in the chat, feel free to disagree. But if you look, for those that don't know his numbers, here are his numbers. Patrick Mahomes threw 27 touchdowns, which is 3 more than Derek Carr, 14 interceptions, which is 6 more than Derek Carr, and right at 4,200 yards, which is about 400 more than Derek Carr. Like, those are pretty close. Yet, I don't think the impact they have on the game is near that close. I think Patrick Mahomes is a far superior player, but at the same time, statistically, Mr. Don's right, they were closer. There's a factor that when we talk about it from a scouting perspective that, we talk about intangibles and how do you really grade and evaluate those. I think that Derek Carr can be a good quarterback. And I think we got to see those. But, for whatever reason, we're talking about losing Tyreek Hill and losing your offensive coordinator. And by the way, Kansas City is actually one of the older teams in the NFL right now as well. Fun fact. So with all those things coming in at once, yeah, you can definitely see a difference in performance, and you wonder how are they going to rebound because we've gotten used to Patrick Mahomes being. It's crazy because I remember how bad apparently the Saints supposedly wanted him back in 2017, but he's been in the league 7 years now, 8 years now. It shows how old I'm getting, but 2-time MVP, right? Offensive Player of the Year, All Pro. He's like a 6-time Pro Bowler. We're used to him just having these dominant plays and snaps and all this other stuff. And yet this year just wasn't that year. So, yeah, it does really speak to how the NFL operates, though. Because, again, Miami at various points in this year was like the clear-cut best team in the league. I'm not trying to say that in a jokey way, but they really were. I mean, up until about Baltimore, which is towards the end of the season, they didn't have as much of a collapse as, Philly did. But, I mean, honestly, until the Baltimore game, I was like, man, this team is it. Then Baltimore put up 56 on them. You're like, oh, damn, that's what you did to the Broncos. And they were hot at the wrong time, right? Like it seemed like Miami had everything working in the beginning and the middle of the season. And then at the end, they lost it. And against big teams, by the way, like they got beat down by Baltimore. But then they ended up losing to Buffalo, which was a big deal. And then Kansas City, in what I would call a tough fought game, ended up taking them down. So a team that was expected to be the number one seed and roll ended up getting washed out just like the Eagles. That's the NFL. So even small changes can bring the Saints to that point of being a successful franchise next year, even with Dennis Allen. And I'm not trying to hype y'all up. I'm just being honest that there's so many layers to what makes a team a good team, right? There's coaching aspects of it, the talent level of players, and any one of those things by themselves can elevate a team. But also the same thing can lower a team. So Harold says Patrick Mahomes' receivers failed him a bunch. They did. And to that point, I think didn't we go over his drop rate? I think we did that a couple of episodes ago here on the show. We talked about the drop rate where Patrick Mahomes, according to SIS, had 39 drops. It was literally double what Derek Carr had. 7% of his passes that were like catchable balls, drops. So that excludes like spikes at the line, stuff like that. 7%. That's a lot, y'all. That's a lot of drops. And again, I'm not trying to take away from either Carr or anybody. It's just there's so many different variables and layers to the NFL. It's also one of the reasons that I love it so daggone much. Like, I have my opinions about basketball. Many of y'all have heard it. I'm really excited about Hawkins. Love when he put up 30 plus the Mavs, and then we weren't able to beat them the second time around, but good hard fought back to back. But anyway, I'm not a basketball guy in terms of like desire to know the game like I am football, because football is just so complex, and I love that complexity. I think it what makes it so special. Antonio says, I get the familiarity aspect or perspective, but it's possible that Ronald Curry took over towards the end of the season. Just looking at the games, all the offensive players ran to him after good plays. That is possible. The only thing I can say is I can't confirm that. I don't know that. And since I don't cover the team like I did when I worked with The Athletic, I'm not trying to get up that close and personal and ask. I'm not saying that I don't have the opportunity to ask things here and there, because I do. But I'm not doing what I once was. So I can't tell you for certain on that one. That's something that you need to go to Triplet or Underhill or Cat Terrell, anybody who covers the team who goes into the locker room, even Ross Jackson, and see if that was the case, if they were willing to, spread that out. And if that is true, that's awesome, because that would really give me a lot of positive hope for what we're seeing, a shift in the offensive coaching structure, right? We'll see. Richard comes back and says, I think if Pete goes to Denver, they'll start balling out. No doubt Pete is a good coach, but should have tried to keep him, where maybe demote him or try to keep him just in general. I'll say the same thing that I said about Pete for 2 years, and the same thing that Drew Brees has said about him, that Sean Payton has said about him, and then other players like Luke McCown came out, was talking about him. Lance Moore today came out and talked about him. I think that he is an extremely humble, reserved, knowledgeable football guy who is great at the inner workings between games. I think that's where Pete Carmichael is probably a very good, very knowledgeable guy in the league. At the same time, I don't think that you keep – I think one thing the Saints have needed to do – this is my opinion. I'm not trying to spit a fact as in I know everything and listen to Rev. I think that New Orleans needs to move on from the Sean Payton era. You can kind of argue that Dennis Allen is not the Sean Payton era, because obviously he came towards the end of it, even though he was here before many years ago. But I think that they need to move on from that. You just need to get past that point in your life. That season is over. Not to get too churchy and everything, but that part of the New Orleans Saints life is done. They need to move on from it. They need to try to find success away from it and stop relying on the pieces that were part of it to try to continue to push them or make playoff pushes with it. Move on. It's over. And I just think that if Pete goes to Denver, that's fantastic for Pete. Man, again, I have nothing negative to I wish him nothing but positive and happiness wherever he ends up going. But I think it's time that they just start moving on from that. And part of that is not just demoting the guy, say, hey, we acknowledge what you're good at. Just go ahead and start and do what you're seeing other teams do. Do what the Lions did, right? You go out and get your head coach guy, and then you go get your offensive coordinator in Ben Johnson. Do what Houston did. You go and get your head coach, and then you go and get your new offensive coordinator. And you can build that slowly over a couple years, like the Lions did, or you can try to do it all at once, like the Texans kind of did. The Texans did have some really big pieces in place. I always argue that. But even then, the Texans, obviously, coaching staff kind of all at once. But either way, you need to move on to the next phase. And sometimes you have a coach that comes in, he's good enough to get you where you're going, but not good enough to take you where you want to be, right? And Dennis Allen might be that guy for the Saints. Like, he's good enough to get them where they want to go, which is back to a winning franchise. But he's not good enough to take them where they want to be, which is a Super Bowl winner, right? You know, because I've said the same thing about the Pelicans. Like, I don't really know if I believe in Willie Green to be the guy that takes the Pelicans and wins a finals championship. But I do believe that he's good enough to raise up young guys. Guys believe in him as a young head coach, and he can get them into being a playoff contender, and then maybe a more experienced guy with a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more ability puts them on that next level. Maybe Dennis Allen can do enough to get the Saints there. I don't know. But I will say, if there's something I do agree with, it is that we need to make the change. And part of making the change is getting rid of Cody Burns and getting rid of Pete Carmichael. And eventually, if things continue, get rid of Dennis Allen. Anyway, Antonio says, when you say move on from Sean coaching, would that logic apply to players like Michael Thomas or you said Al, assuming AK? To an extent, yes. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that they've kind of already done that with Michael Thomas. You look how they've restructured him, and they've basically kept him around as if you can still play, great, but we're not building the offense around you, right? They've tried to move from Michael Thomas. You look at Alvin Kamara, they've already started to try to move from Alvin Kamara. Now, that isn't to say that Alvin Kamara is not still a really good player. I feel like Alvin Kamara had another very good season. They're already trying to do those things, right? Like, there's a reason you go and get Kendre Miller. And I will say that I hated that Kendre Miller was not healthy most of the season, but you saw that last game of the year, the Kendre Miller was like, oh, that's kind of what we were looking for if he could be healthy to work on replacing AK. So it absolutely does apply. But at the same time, it's a little bit different with players versus coaches. The reason I say that is we talk about, let's use the West Coast offense. You hear me talk about a lot because the Saints have run it for 15-something years, right? John Payton has a West Coast version. Pete Carmichael showed us his version. But you have a lot of other coaches who can do it maybe in a better way or more, creative way. That's the term I love to use with, the Shanahan tree right now, because Shanahan runs a West Coast style system. But at the same time, if you study what Brock Purdy is doing and Christian McCaffrey and Debo and all those guys over there, you take out the RPO element, the outside zone running, the same type of concepts, you see them. And one big one, and TJ, if you want to go grab the link to this Twitter post and throw it in the chat real quick for those who are watching live to show them, a great example of creativity is Bobby Slowick against the Cleveland Browns. He's the offensive coordinator for the Houston Texans. Ran a play that I literally made a t-shirt about for the Saints because they run it so often, called the Yankee concept. But he changed it up. How did he change it up? So what he did is, the Yankee concept is a post route that has a deep in route underneath it. The whole goal is to get a safety to either bite down or play up. So you put a safety in conflict that he has to make a choice between two people. So one defender, two routes, that's the goal. But when you get really to the high-end teams in the NFL, like the Cleveland Browns, they had a two-deep set, a little bit of a quarters look. Here's the catch. You probably just, plays don't just kind of go there. They see the play throughout the year. They know what you're going to do. So what did they do? They changed it up in two ways. Here's how they changed it. I actually changed it up in three ways. So even though the routes were basically the same, number one, they added motion. Motion with the tight end to come behind C.J. Stroud. With that, they ran a boot from it. So there's two things that the boot's going to do with that motion. Number one, you got to worry about the, end around. Or jet sweep. You got to worry about that as a defense. So automatically playing lower. Boot action. You have a tight end that's going to leak into the flat. It gives you a safety valve. And the boot action almost always guarantees that you get about 3 seconds to throw a football because you are moving away while you drew momentum in the opposite direction. Here's what they did with the routes. The backside route was still that in route to try to draw a guy down below. I think it was Nico that was running the underneath route. And then what did they do with the post route? instead of it just being a standard post route, they actually did an out the post. They did a corner post. So we're going to show to the outside and then break really quick to the inside. And that break occurred, timing perfect here. The break literally occurred right as CJ's hitting his round out to the boot and right as Nico's going underneath, so the safety bites down. Big bomb over the top. Houston Texans make a tremendously big play. The idea behind the play, the Yankee concept, is something that every West Coast offense has as a staple. Yet there's a way to run it in the bland traditional way, or a way to be creative against the opponent that you're facing. So this is the whole thing of what you really want if you're a New Orleans Saints fan. You want someone who can come in and take the players who are fitting one system and find a way to creatively use them and get the guys the ball that need the ball, to get the ball into the hands of your playmakers. That's what you're looking for, right? So whether you get a, Air Coryell, Air Raid, West Coast, whatever, the idea is to do it in a way that gets the ball into your playmakers' hands and also does it in a way that, in terms of the situation that you're playing, isn't easy to read, isn't diagnosed. It's creative, right? If you are expecting pressures, then let's do more of boot action, play action. Get the ball away from the defense, even if it only buys you a couple seconds, because there's dangers to doing a boot action, right? You can have the strong safety read it and collapse down while the underneath corner decides to play the flat. So then now your quarterback literally has no blockers and a guy's beaming at him. So it's not like everything doesn't have an inherent danger, but when you know when to call those plays and how to draw them up and how to design them, that's when you know a guy is really good. Like, I love listening to Kyle Shanahan's interview. It was yesterday. He was like, look, by the second quarter, he had already started studying the Green Bay Packers, believing they were going to win so they could game plan against their defense. That's what you want for whoever New Orleans ends up getting as the offensive coordinator. If that's Ronald Curry, that's what I expect from him. That's the level of dedication and ability that I want to see. Whether they get Clint Kubiak, which is who I want from San Francisco, that's what you need to be. Whoever that ends up being, that's what you're looking for. The ability to be creative with concepts that this team can already run because they have the personnel to run them. That's what we're talking about, right? Don says Kendre Miller has the juice. That last game showed me a lot. He just has to be healthy. I hate that phrase when it comes to New Orleans Saints. I've gotten so used to that phrase. It's negative. Yes, just got to stay healthy. Just got to stay healthy, right? Antonio says, I wish Kendre didn't have an injury history because in that last game he showed it could be effective. See, multiple people saying that, and that's absolutely accurate, right? So, yeah, if y'all haven't checked it out, Chase Daniels actually broke down that play that I just kind of broke down for y'all if y'all want to go see Chase Daniels talk about it. But when you look at the design, I would then go say, okay, what's that T-shirt we made? I know TJ has one. It's that Pull the Trigger T-shirt. And I'm not trying to promo the T-shirt here. If y'all want to go buy the T-shirt, please support the channel. The point I'm making is that's a common design. Like that's not a unique thing, right? But the key is, can you do it in a way that comes unexpected or comes and, surprises the team when it happens? Exactly how you saw it happen in the playoffs, right? And if you can do that, doesn't matter what formation you're running out of. The key is being creative. The key is finding a way to fool a defense, and that's something that I just don't feel that this team figured out until the very end of the season, and that's just way too long. Way, way, way too long. And that was always my biggest gripe with Carmichael is, you didn't see consistency. You had so many struggles for so long, and by the time that it was working, it was just too late. It was just too late. So, also, Mr. Don, I appreciate you. We do need to give a shout out to former New Orleans Saints draft pick and say rest in peace and rest in power to Ronald Powell. Ronald Powell sadly passed away. Junior Gillette was actually the one that posted it on social media. Ronald Powell has passed away, and if you remember, the Saints drafted him back in 2014, I think. So, shout out to him. His last playing days were in the wasn't the CSFL, or I'm sorry, the USFL, but one of the leagues back in 2018. So rest in power to him, rest in peace. That does really stink. But yeah, some Saints news that was kind of unexpected for this week because obviously that's a young man. He's younger than I am. So kind of like one of those eye-opening moments. I think he was 32 years old and born in, 91. That's a young man to pass away as a father, obviously player, That sucks. So, moving on to other topics, Antonio is extremely hard, man. He's one of the few players in his day, but at this point, he's more distraction than playmaker. Talking about MT. I believe it's time to cut ties. Just my opinion. Maybe. Maybe. I would say this. AT showed a lot of what you want to see, but it also wasn't enough. You need more. You need more. You still need more. And again, I'm not trying to speak negatively about the New Orleans Saints. I'm not trying to speak negatively about Michael Thomas, but A.T. Perry, he could be the future. Michael Thomas also was effective when he was healthy. He just wasn't, all pro anymore. And that was fine. I mean, hell, I said it all season long. Michael Thomas as a player, he did better than I expected. Now, he's going to end the season with 357 yards. 448 yards, which is not necessarily the most impressive number, but the dude was on pace for a 900-yard season. And y'all go back to when we talked in preseason, my expectations, if he had 700, I was going to be hella impressed. The dude had 450 in 10 games. I thought he looked good. I just didn't think he looked great, right? And either way, it was time. You knew that you were going to have to move on, but I think he showed that he still could contribute. And if he is on a super cheap deal, I'm not opposed to him continually contributing. But at the same time, I look at this team and I go, well, one of the biggest issues is health and is age. And there's a reason that those two things often go together. It's not always the truth, but generally, as you get older in this league, you suffer with injury more. Hell, Cameron Jordan suffered through injury all year. Shout out to him for playing through it, but he suffered through injury all year long. And A.T. Perry played, 10 games, but 3 starts, 250 yards, and 4 TDs. That's the future, right? That's what you hope is the future. For a rookie who's a 6th rounder, who didn't get but 3 starts, that's good numbers. That's not amazing numbers, but that's more numbers than Foster Moreau did, because Foster Moreau didn't even reach 200 yards receiving, only had 1 TD. And Juwan Johnson, no offense, Mr. Johnson, because you did turn it on the end of the year, Juwan was a disappointment most of the season. He had that injury, and when he came back, it wasn't really good, took him time, and he ended up with 368 and 4 tutties. We thought Juwan Johnson was going to be a 700-yard, 7 to 10 TD tight end. And statistically, he did worse than last year, even though he only played 3 less games. So I love MT, love his passion. Yeah, it's definitely time to find somebody else, right? You got to find somebody to be that guy. Picking points is too much or not enough. Trade Lattimore and entire 2004 draft picks for number 1 overall. Absolutely not. Definitely no. No. Absolutely not. No. Definitely. I would say no. My opinion is absolutely not. Also, that wouldn't be enough to get the number 1 overall pick. I don't think that would be enough to get the overall pick. But even then, no. Absolutely not. No. Not the team that I'm talking about being the oldest team in the daggum league. You want to get rid of literally everything. Give it to Chicago. For who? For what? What one singular player comes into a Dennis Allen-led team and takes us over the hoop, over the hump? No. That's just my thoughts. We are, by the way, literally 100 days from the NFL draft right now. We are 100 days. It's like 99 days, 23 hours, and 15 minutes from the NFL draft. It's a coming. It's a coming. Now, if you saw a quarterback in this year's draft that you thought was like a Patrick Mahomes or Andrew Luck or something like that, maybe. Does anybody think that about any of these quarterbacks? If you do, I guess cool. But would I personally trade Marshawn Lattimore in my entire draft to Chicago, which is technically Carolina's pick? No. Rev would not. If you would, I respect your opinion, because everybody's allowed to have it. And I encourage you to go try to make that trade in all your mock drafts this year, because we're getting into mock draft season. But what would I rather do? My butt would rather stick at pick 14, because the fact that you managed to have a winning record and still be a top 15 pick is kind of fortuitous. And I'd start repairing those offensive and defensive lines you got. And if you do have a quarterback you love at 14, odds are they're going to be available, right? Because You look at the quarterback situation, it's Drake May and Caleb Williams. It's probably most people's too, but you've got Jaden Daniels. I know all you LSU fans are going to get real mad that I didn't have Jaden Daniels as number 1 overall. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, Jaden Daniels is not a guy that translates to every team in the league. So you're going to have a lot of guys. There's a Daniel Jeremiah was actually talking about this of like the top 5 offensive tackles. Every team's going to have them graded differently, like in terms of the order that they're in. So you can love Jaden Daniels. Cool. I have nothing against Jaden Daniels. You know, whoever ends up being that guy, there are probably 4 to 5 quarterbacks, I will say, that are first round-ish. And New Orleans will probably have 2 of them on the board. They'll probably have 2 of them on the board. I'm still not convinced that the Justin Fields is over in Chicago, but it could be. We'll see. But New Orleans is going to have options at 14. They're going to have options at 14. So, think they took away the breakers? It does stink that they took away the breakers. I agree with that. Yeah. I agree with that. I don't like that the New Orleans breakers are no longer a thing, and I didn't even pick up a jersey from them. So, I didn't pick up a jersey. Ricky says, I don't believe that the Saints fire Pete Carmichael and the crew. I believe it was a mutual agreement to satisfy our fan base when knowing the DA is part of the problem also. No, because if they, here's the, Ricky, I know you don't want to hear this. If they really believe DA is a problem, they get rid of DA. I promise you they're not just catering to the fan base and like making Pete Carmichael fall on the sword. Love it or hate it, and obviously most of us hate it, they believe, and I told y'all this, for weeks, for months, technically a year. They see this team because they're looking and seeing a team that just went 9-8. They're seeing a team that was this close to winning the division 2 years in a row. They see a team in the facility. They look at this team and they see a team that is a contender. Now we, from the outside, don't agree with that, Ricky. We do not. But it has nothing to do with placating the fans. They believe in what Dennis Allen is doing right now. That's why Mickey Loomis went to the locker room at the end of the season to have a conversation about culture with the players. And the players said it was a well-received conversation. They believe in Mickey. I'm sorry. They believe in DA in that front office. They did not just say, hey, Pete Carmichael, somebody got to go and you're it. No, they believe in DA. Right or wrong. I promise you, they're not just trying to like put up an offering and hope the fans still follow. And I will also add this. If any NFL team is doing that, and if the Saints reach that point, man, we are in NFL hell. Right? See, Jay says Cody Burns over Doug Marrone. I really can't say Cody Burns over Doug Marrone, and I don't necessarily like Doug Marrone. Because again, what did we all as a collective spend a lot of this season complaining about? The wide receivers running bad routes, wrong routes, and miscommunication consistently. That's coaching. Right? That's coaching. Now, at the same time, I understand where they're coming from with saying that DA is 9-8 this year and he showed improvement, and that's a factual statement. But at the same time, what has DA continually struggled with? Close games and games against superior opponents, as in teams with winning records. He can't beat them. He hasn't shown that yet, but he still went 9-8. So there's multiple truths to be had here, right? TJ says, I attributed the development of Shaheed to Burns. Maybe that's wrong. I can't say yes or no on that, right? Like, again, this goes back to what I said 30 minutes ago. I'm not in the facility. I can only give you what I think based on what I've learned and things that I've done. But I will say this, that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. He very well could be a big reason that Rashid Shaheed became a better player. But at the same time, when you're halfway through the season and you have receivers running wrong routes and receivers running on top of each other and receivers with the wrong splits and receivers who run the wrong plays, that's coaching. But to be clear, I'm not putting all that on Cody Burns because I've also been calling for Pete Carmichael's head for a year. So I think that he could. I don't think that everything Cody did was bad. Mr. Burns knows a hell of a lot more about wide receivers than I do. I don't think everything he did was bad, but at the same time, I don't think that he was showing to be an elite wide receiver coach either. So there's probably a mixed truth there. Probably a mixed truth there. Mr. Don says, I'd never draft a tight end in the top 15. I've never seen a tight end go that high, and it'd be worth it. Even worse than taking a running back that high. I don't agree with you that it's worse than taking a running back that high, but I do understand your point. Case in point, I don't know how many of y'all tend to listen to Falcons podcast. I know that there are hated rivals, and we, want their franchise to burn in hell. But I do listen to them every now and then. And you know who they are questioning / don't believe in? Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts. Was he worth it? Was he worth it? Yeah, tight end and running back are positions that historically do not give good returns when you draft them in the top 10, 15. And for running back, historically, it's one of the very rare positions that you can find success outside the first round, like predictable success. Because there was a really, 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 I wish I had the thread, I could throw it to you. Really good thread on Twitter today, or X, sorry, Elon, about quarterback success rate and how significantly it not only drops off in the second round, but drops off when it's not the number one quarterback overall. There are definitely positions that the higher up you take them, the more likely you are probably to find a guy who is competent and good at his position. But running back is one that we see historically that you can find guys who are really good second round, third round, right? Like, good example. Look at the Atlanta Falcons. Just for a second, I know you don't want to. Think of it in a positive way. You beat the snot out of them to end the year. That's a positive, right? But look at the Atlanta Falcons. They have two running backs at 23 years age or younger who I would call high-end to elite running backs. One of them, they took 8th overall in Bijan Robinson. The other one, they took in the 5th round, Tyler Algier. And I like both of them a lot. And Tyler Algier will not get the same level of respect. But that man was a 1,000-yard rusher before they drafted Bijan Robinson. And he still was a 700-yard rusher, almost 900 total yards and more TDs with Bijan Robinson. I mean, they're basically trying to create their own Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara. But he was a 5th rounder, round 5. And that's just one example. But you go across the league this past year, and what I always love to do is you go through the league leaders any given season, right? And then you look at position to position, where are those guys successful? You go look at quarterbacks, and you look at the top quarterbacks. What is the theme amongst the top quarterbacks? The theme on the top quarterbacks is generally their first-round draft picks. Now go do the same thing of like the top 10 quarterbacks. The top 10 running backs, right? Kieran Williams with the Rams, 5th rounder, right? James Cook, 2nd rounder, right? DeAndre Swift, he was also, I'm pretty sure, a 2nd rounder. Najee Harris was 24th overall, so very late first rounder. Who's another one? When was David Montgomery drafted? David Montgomery. He was probably, what was he, 3rd round? So, and obviously Alvin Kamara. Joe Mixon fell probably more because of off the field, but he was a 2nd rounder. But even if we ignore Joe Mixon, like, there is a theme where you can find quality. James Conner, who just had his, first 1,000-yard season? His first 1,000-yard season this year for Arizona. He was like a 2nd, 3rd round pick. Consistently. Top 10, Tony Pollard. They just replaced, hey, Ezekiel Elliott, you can go ahead and go do absolutely nothing in New England. Tony Pollard's got it, 4th round. So running back's a position that you can find that spot. So like drafting it in the first round just never made sense to me. Now, I did see the rumor, Mike. We talked about it earlier about Kyle Harley potentially becoming the GM, whether that's in name only to save him and keep him here from Carolina or what. But I support it. We just got to wait and see if it's a thing, right? Wait and see if it's a thing. Belt says, have to give DA credit to his defense, get an offensive coordinator, knows what he's doing. And if we don't make the playoffs, then we really know, what are we going to do with the offensive line? And I have to say real quick, Belt, I agree with you to an extent. I don't want to take all the blame off DA's shoulders. I do want to add real quick, it ain't just the O-line. It's the D-line too. I'm not trying to be a hater. I'm really not. The New Orleans Saints, D-line needs work. Why do I say that? They finished with 34 sacks this season. It's actually one of the lowest marks in the league. But beyond that, not just being one of the lowest marks in the league, it's actually the first time that they've had less than 40 sacks in like 5 or 6 years. I think we have to go back to, I'll look at it real quick while we're live streaming, but we have to go back to 2017. They had 42. See, and keep in mind, that's 16 game seasons. We were in 17 game seasons and had 34. You have to go back to 2016. The last time the Saints did not get at least 40 sacks. It's the D-line too. It's the D-line too. And even though I do think that Cameron Jordan playing through an injury had an impact, at the same time, I don't believe Cameron Jordan is what he used to be either. They have got to find a way. They have got to find a way to address the offensive line and the defensive line if they want this team to have any type of success this upcoming year. The trenches need work on both sides. You've got 2 tackle positions that are big mysteries right now, and you need more pass rush. And no offense to Carl Granderson, because I do think that Carl Granderson is an above-average player, but you need help in that pass rush, right? Like, I think Carl Granderson was good, but I don't think that he was elite. And he could pop up and be elite. I think the contract we signed him to was very good for New Orleans. I really do. I have no issue with his contract. I have no issue with his play. But Carl Granderson by himself is not game-changing. And it sucks when your second best sack guy on the defensive line was your rookie 3-tech. Brian Brzee had 4.5. And then your backup 3-tech, technically he was actually the starter, Nate Shepard, was third with 3.5, and Nate Shepard's going to be 31 years old. Carl Granderson's going to be 28 years old. And after that was Tano Passion with 3.5. He's going to be 30 years old next year. And then it was Cameron Jordan with 2. He's going to be 35. You have got to get the defensive line younger and hungrier. And the offensive line. So, both of them. Both of them. Get them all. You need everything right now. And I mean, okay, it's an exaggeration. You don't need everything, but you definitely need to focus on defensive line as much as offensive line. And we know how much they need to focus on offensive line. I just think that the defensive line, for me, hasn't been brought up enough. I think the defensive line needs to get brought up more because Dennis Allen is a defensive coach. And if his defense of all things starts to fail, how can we have any hope for the offense? So defensively, the best edge rusher, that's kind of a tough one because you got to talk about edge rushers that can actually like fit the Dennis Allen mold. And you're talking about guys like Letu out of UCLA, maybe Trice out of Washington, JT out of Ohio State, maybe. But, God, I feel like that would be too much of what you already have. You really got to get DA to get a guy who's willing to just be a pass rusher. But anyway, all these things to say, even because we know they really not go after a guy like Dallas Turner out of Alabama because he's so small, right? He's like 240 pounds. And you just know DA is not going to go after that. I mean, DA struggles to accept that that's a real player. But they got to do defensive line. We got to do defensive line. So, 2017 draft is a once-in-a-lifetime deal. Don't ever expect that again. I mean, I wouldn't say that. Mr. Don, we do hype up the 2017 a lot, and I think deservedly so. But I'd also say that the New Orleans Saints have been very good at drafting overall for a while with a dip, and that dip was noticeable when it happened. I think the biggest reason the dip was so noticeable is because the Saints stopped drafting a lot of guys. They had seasons where they were drafting like 4 people, like Cesar Ruiz, Zach Baldwin, Adam Trautman, Tommy Stevens. That's it. And one of those guys was a 7th-round quarterback. I think that was their biggest issue. But you go back like historically, they've had really good drafts. 2017, obviously, banger. You nailed it, right? You did extremely well. But I'd argue that the 2015 draft was a very good draft. It just didn't have as much like high end on it. Why do I say that? Anders Pete. Love him, hate him, shit on him all you want. Anders Pete has been a multiple-time Pro Bowler and a very good player when he plays. Stephon Anthony, cool. That was a miss. But Alohi Kikaha, had it not been for injuries where he blew blew up after 5 games, looked good. But let's ignore that. PJ Williams was a very good player as a role player for a long time. Tyler Davison, still in the league today, is a solid nose tackle in terms of run stopper. Got that in the 5th round. That was fine, right? Like, you did okay. And then, hell, I think one of the most underrated ones is 2006. Because we got so big on 2007, we forgot how damn good 2006 was. Reggie Bush, Roman Harper, Jari Evans, Rob Ninkovich, which wasn't really ours, but I'm still claiming it. Zach Strief, Marcus Colston. So I don't want to call 2017 once in a lifetime, because 2016 literally has got one guy who, in my opinion, is a Hall of Famer in Jari Evans. And then you have 4 guys who are Saints Hall of Famers, like Saints Ring of Honor type players. So I think the biggest issue is the Saints need to actually draft more. Get more people. You need more picks. Stop drafting 4 or 5 guys. You need to be able to throw several darts at the dartboard and try to hit. And that way, when you do have, a draft where you get several guys who are, in like the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, if one of them doesn't work out, like Davis told us, no big deal, because Tyler Davison did, right? Or even go back to more recent years. Look at 2021. Peyton Turner's obviously been an injury guy, and we complain about the injuries. Fine. However, Pete Warner, very good starter. Maybe not elite, but very good. Paulson Adebo. Love that one. Love that Paulson Adebo. It's panned out so great. You took a flyer on Ian Book. That went nowhere. Maybe we should stop drafting quarterbacks. Landon Young. Look, I'm not going to say anything about Landon Young. A 6th-round guy who has come in, and he's had his injuries up and down, but you've needed him to come in and play. And he played 13 games this year with 4 starts. He's 26 years old. Even if he's just a depth guy, you found depth offensive line in the 6th round that's been in the NFL 3 years and actually hasn't looked terrible. He's not looked like Ryan Ramczyk, but that's good drafting. Like, the fact that you managed to find depth and didn't have to go have a overpriced free agent fill that spot, and a 6th-rounder's paycheck is filling that spot, that's good drafting. You just need to actually draft more than 5 guys in a season. Like, go out there and draft 7, 8 players. Trade back if you need to. Get more picks. That's when the Saints really shine, because you don't notice the misses as much. You don't notice the misses as much. So, hey, when Sean would trade away our picks to move up, it usually doesn't work. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that. Another Peyton Turner Davenport washout. Who, Ted? Who? 6th-rounder making the team out of camp is a win? It is. And the fact that we have multiple guys, and I don't think that the Saints have kept multiple guys just because we've sucked. Like, I don't think they kept A.T. Perry, who they got in the 6th round, because our wide receivers sucked. I think we kept A.T. Perry because he showed a lot of promise. He was good. I think the same thing is true of Landon Young, right? I think the same thing was true of Caden Ellis. Remember, Caden Ellis was a 7th-round pick, and even though he went over to go play with Atlanta, and I hope he stubs his toe every time he hits the field, a 7th-round guy that you developed into a good player, right? Boston Scott, going back to 2018. Everybody shits on the 2018 draft class, but 2018 draft class has got 5 players who have played 120 games or more. I'm sorry. I have 5 players who have played 60 games or more. 120 was their pick. I got to read before I talk. But 60 games or more, because that had been a shit ton of games. They've been playing in multiple leagues, apparently, since 2018. They played 60-plus games. Boston Scott, Will Clapp, right? Now, the 2018 draft class suffered from the fact that the Saints team was loaded, mostly because of 2017's draft class. 2018 had guys who stayed in the league and contributed a lot. The only players from that draft class who did nothing were Rick Leonard and Cameron Moore. Will Clapp, Boston Scott, and Terrell Jamerson, Traquan Smith, and Marcus Davenport all contributed heavily in the NFL. Maybe none of them became great, but they all contributed a lot and played a lot in the NFL. And the fact that you got a 6th and 7th rounder that have actually played like the most games there, that's big. That's good drafting. So we'll see. Some people thought A.T. Perry would go in the 3rd round. I agree. We were in that conversation, right? But at the same time, you get drafted where you get drafted. You lose context after, 10 years. And you're like, yeah, that guy could have been drafted higher. So, yeah, exactly, Mr. Don. So, my hope is, because right now, the thought is that the New Orleans Saints are going to end up with several comp picks. As of now, the New Orleans Saints potentially will be getting 3 fifth-round comp picks. Potentially. Which would mean that they have a first, second, fifth, technically 4 fifths, then 2 sixes, and a seventh. What they'll probably end up doing is trading some of those fifths and stuff up to try to get into like the 3rd or 4th round and probably have to use like a 3rd for next year or something. But as of now, they're expected to have like 9 draft picks. Most of them are day 3 picks. Same time, it's one of the rare teams and rare scouting teams I trust with day 3 picks. And I know we dump on them a lot because the Saints have struggled lately in terms of record. But the Landon Youngs and the A.T. Perrys and the Jordan Howdens, I think give you reason to believe that this team can find those type of guys on day 3. So, anyway, we've hit our 1 hour mark. We got to wrap up. I appreciate y'all. Can't wait to see what news pops out more from the New Orleans Saints and all the things that are going on. I hope y'all enjoyed the conversation. I absolutely did. Who dat? God bless. We will catch you all on the next Who Dat Confessional. Deuces. That's me. Love every single one of you. You're all amazing. Catch us in the Discord. Catch me on Twitter at RevDeuceWinham. See ya on the next one.